Welcome back to Velentra Tales, wishing you a truly good day, filled with calm moments and gentle things ahead. And now, let's dive together into today's story.
My husband made me serve drinks at his promotion party while his mistress sat in my seat wearing my jewelry. His boss looked at me with pity. I smiled and kept serving. At midnight, his boss stood up to make a toast. He called my name. My husband's face changed. What happened next made her remove my necklace. "Promise me something," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible over the hospice room's medical equipment. I leaned closer, holding her hand. She'd stopped speaking clearly 2 days ago, but tonight her eyes were focused, urgent. "Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here. If you believe that quiet dignity deserves recognition and truth matters more than appearances, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. When the time comes," she said slowly, each word costing her, "let truth matter more than kindness." That was 3 months ago. Tonight, I stood in the service entrance of Riverside Country Club, tying an apron over the gray dress Greg had ordered me to wear, and I understood what Dorothy meant. Through the doorway, I could see the party already starting. 50 guests from Cartwright Industries, celebrating my husband's promotion to vice president. Champagne. Catered food. A head table where Greg sat laughing, his arm around a woman 20 years younger than me. Brittany. His mistress. Wearing Dorothy's sapphire necklace. The necklace Dorothy wore to her 40th anniversary. The necklace with her maiden name engraved inside the clasp. The necklace Greg stole from her hospital room while I was talking to the hospice nurse about her final arrangements. I picked up a tray of champagne glasses. Nobody looked at me as I entered the main room. Why would they? I was just part of the catering staff. Not the wife who'd stood beside Greg at a dozen company events. Not the teacher who'd spent 15 years working with struggling students. Not the woman who'd sacrificed 3 years caring for Greg's dying mother while he visited exactly 4 times. Just the help. Greg had specifically instructed me to arrive early and make myself useful, instead of sitting at tables, pretending to be someone I'm not. So I'd agreed. What he didn't know was that his mother had left me everything in her will. $2 million. The family home. Every piece of jewelry Brittany was currently wearing. What he didn't know was that his boss William Cartwright's daughter Sarah had been my student 6 years ago, and I'd changed her life. What he didn't know was that at midnight, William was going to stand up to make a toast that would destroy everything Greg had built on lies. I moved between tables, offering champagne, picking up empty plates, invisible. Dorothy's voice echoed in my memory. Let truth matter more than kindness. Midnight was 2 hours away. I could wait 2 more hours. I'd already waited 3 years. The morning had started the way every morning started for the past 8 months. My phone buzzing at 5:30 a.m. Not an alarm. Text messages from Greg. 17 of them this time, all sent between midnight and 3 in the morning while I slept in the guest bedroom down the hall. Gray dress. Not the blue one. Arrive by 5:30. I need help with setup. Bring the good napkins from the linen closet. Don't mention you're a teacher unless someone asks directly. Nobody cares about high school English. I'd sat up in the narrow twin bed that had become my entire world and read through each one. Instructions. Always instructions. How to dress, how to act, what to say, when to arrive, where to stand. Greg said I'd moved to the guest bedroom temporarily because his important work calls were disturbing my sleep. That was 8 months ago. The calls hadn't stopped. I just wasn't invited back. The guest bedroom held exactly 3 pieces of furniture. The twin bed, a small dresser, and Dorothy's old desk. The desk was the only thing Greg let me keep after the funeral. Everything else from her house, 40 years of memories, belongings, furniture, went into storage or got donated in a single weekend. We don't need her old junk cluttering our space, Greg had said, carrying boxes to his car. I'd fought for the desk. Actually fought, one of the few times I'd pushed back in recent years. It was where I graded papers now, where I planned lessons for my students, where I existed in the only space that still felt mine. This morning a stack of essays sat waiting. I turned on the small lamp and started reading, my red pen moving across pages while dawn crept through the window. 17 texts from my husband. Not one asked how I slept. By 7 a.m. I was driving 40 minutes out of town to meet Patricia Hendricks at Miller's Diner, a place Greg would never think to look for me. We'd been meeting here monthly since Dorothy's funeral. Patricia with her silver hair and steady hands that had managed Dorothy's legal affairs for 30 years. Me with my questions about what happened next. She was already in our usual booth when I arrived, a folder on the table between us. The portfolio gained another 100,000, Patricia said, sliding papers across the worn surface. You're at 1.3 million in investments now. I stared at the numbers. They still didn't feel real. The house appraisal came back at 465, she continued, flipping pages. The antique collection, we had it professionally assessed last week, 192. $2 million. Dorothy had left me $2 million and Greg had no idea. She knew what he was, Patricia said quietly. Dorothy watched him treat you like hired help for 3 years while you bathed her, fed her, read to her every night. You know how many times Greg visited his own mother during those final years? 4 times, I said. I'd counted. 4 times. And every visit he asked about money. Asked if she'd updated her will. Asked if everything was in order. Never asked how she felt. Never stayed longer than 20 minutes. I remembered those visits. Greg standing in Dorothy's doorway, uncomfortable, checking his watch. Dorothy would watch him with eyes that had grown sharp even as her body failed. After he left, she'd reach for my hand without speaking. He saw what he was long before I did. Greg received exactly what was in her original will from 1997, Patricia explained. 25,000 and his father's watch collection. Everything else goes to you. It's been yours legally since 3 days after her death. I thought about tonight. About Brittany sitting at the head table wearing Dorothy's jewelry. The sapphire necklace. The diamond earrings that came from Ireland in 1923. The pearl bracelet Dorothy wore to church every Sunday for 43 years. Greg had taken them from her hospital room during those final days. I'd seen him come out with his pockets weighted, his face expressionless. You documented the theft, Patricia reminded me, reading my thoughts. We have photographs of Dorothy's jewelry box before and after. We could press charges. Not yet, I said, the same answer I'd given for 3 months. Dorothy wanted me to choose my own timing. Patricia smiled slightly. She chose well. By 8:15 I was at Lincoln High, unlocking my classroom while the building still echoed with early morning quiet. I started the coffee maker. I kept one for students who showed up without breakfast, which was more of them than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The handmade card sat on my desk where Marcus had left it yesterday. Inside, his mother's note made my throat tight. Thank you for helping my son read his first complete novel at 16. The doctor said he'd never read above 5th grade level. You proved them wrong. I filed it with the others. 3 dozen similar notes stuffed in my desk drawer like evidence of a life that mattered. Mrs. Chin stopped by during my planning period, leaning against the doorframe with the expression that meant she was about to push. The literacy coordinator position, she said. Rachel, it's been open for 6 weeks. You're the only person qualified. 12,000 more a year. Greg thinks I'm taking on too much already, I said automatically. Mrs. Chen's disappointment showed in the set of her shoulders. She left without pushing further. At lunch, Jennifer mentioned seeing Greg at Riverside Country Club last week. With a young woman, she said carefully. Wearing really beautiful jewelry. I smiled and changed the subject. I'd known about Brittany for 14 months. Found the first hotel receipt in his car. Then the credit card statements. Dinners at expensive restaurants always charged for 2 people. Then the text messages, increasingly careless. I'd photographed everything. Built a file Patricia said would be devastating in divorce proceedings. By 4 p.m. I was standing in our bedroom, the one I no longer slept in, looking at the gray dress Greg had laid out with military precision. Next to it, a note, minimal makeup. You're there to support, not compete. Support. Not compete. I looked at myself in the mirror. 42 years old. Dark circles under my eyes from 3 years caring for Dorothy. Hair pulled back in the same ponytail I'd worn since Greg told me, women your age look desperate when they try too hard with their appearance. The woman in the mirror looked defeated. My students wouldn't recognize her. I found the bill on Greg's desk. Riverside Country Club. $8,500 for tonight's party. Charged to the credit card he forbid me to use. Funded by my teaching salary that deposited into our account that only he controlled. I thought about the house sitting in my name. the $1 million portfolio growing monthly. Dorothy's gift wasn't just money. It was patience. I dressed in the shapeless gray dress. Applied minimal makeup. Drove to Riverside in my 11-year-old Honda while Greg took his leased BMW. In my purse I carried one small photograph of Dorothy from hospice. The day she made me promise. Now moving between tables with my champagne tray, I felt that photograph like a talisman against my hip. A woman at table 6 asked for more champagne without looking at my face. I poured. Moved on. At the head table, Brittany laughed at something an executive said, her hand touching the sapphire necklace absently. Greg caught my eye across the room. Nodded once. Approval that I was following instructions. I nodded back. He thought he'd won. Thought he'd successfully transformed me into exactly what he needed. Invisible, useful, controlled. What he didn't understand was that invisibility had given me something he never anticipated. Time. Documentation. Clarity. And allies he didn't know existed. William Cartwright sat 3 seats from Greg, watching the room with the quiet attention of a man who missed nothing. His wife Margaret was somewhere near the back, coordinating with the catering staff. They both knew who I was. They both knew what was coming at midnight. I circulated through the room, collecting empty glasses, refilling champagne, picking up discarded napkins. The perfect servant. Dorothy's voice whispered through my memory. Let truth matter more than kindness. 1 hour and 45 minutes until midnight. I could wait. The service entrance smelled like industrial cleaner and something floral I couldn't identify. I stood there at exactly 5:30 p.m., adjusting the apron over Dorothy's gray dress, while through the propped open door I could see the main entrance where guests were arriving. Brittany stood there greeting them. She wore emerald green, a cocktail dress that probably cost what I made in a month. Her hair was styled in loose waves that looked effortless but weren't. She laughed at something a guest said, touching their arm with easy confidence. Around her neck, Dorothy's sapphire necklace caught the evening light. Can I help you? I turned. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a clipboard stood in the service hallway, looking at me with polite confusion. I'm Rachel Morrison, I said. Greg Morrison's wife. I'm here to help with service tonight. Something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe concern, before her professional mask slid back into place. Her eyes went from my face to the apron I'd already tied on, then toward the main entrance where Brittany was laughing with another arriving couple. The calculation was silent but clear. The tired woman in the service entrance versus the radiant young woman greeting guests at the front. Mrs. Morrison, she said carefully, I'm Susan Chin, the event coordinator. I wasn't aware you'd be helping with service. Would you prefer to join the guests? I'm sure we can find you a seat. Greg asked me to help, I said, keeping my voice pleasant. I want to support his evening. Susan studied me for another moment. I could see her deciding whether to push, whether to question, whether to do what was clearly the compassionate thing and insist I join the guests as the wife of the guest of honor. She didn't push. Of course, she said finally. Champagne service is starting now. If you could take a tray and circulate through the main room. She handed me a tray of glasses, each one perfectly positioned, condensation already forming on the stems. I walked through the doorway into soft lighting and conversations already flowing. 50 people filled the room. Executives from Cartwright Industries, department heads, a few clients I recognized from previous company events. I'd been to a dozen parties in this exact space over the years, always standing beside Greg, always introduced as, my wife, the teacher, in a tone that made my profession sound like a cute hobby. Now I moved through the same crowd carrying drinks. Nobody looked at me. Not really. Their eyes slid past the way eyes slide past service staff, past people who exist to facilitate rather than participate. I recognized Tom Henderson from accounting. I'd sat beside his wife at last year's holiday party, talked about her mother's struggle with dementia. He reached for a glass without glancing at my face. I recognized Patricia Walsh from marketing. She'd asked me about teaching strategies for her son who hated reading. She took champagne and continued her conversation without pause. Invisible. Exactly as Greg intended. I moved toward the head table, the tray balanced on my palm with practice I didn't know I had. That's when I saw the jewelry clearly for the first time tonight. The sapphire necklace sat against Brittany's throat, the deep blue stone catching light with every movement. Dorothy had worn it to her 40th anniversary. I'd seen the photos, Dorothy and James dancing, the necklace brilliant against her navy dress, her smile wide and genuine. The diamond earrings sparkled with each turn of Brittany's head. 3 generations. Dorothy's grandmother brought them from Ireland in 1923, sewn into the hem of her coat because she couldn't afford to ship them safely. Dorothy told me that story during one of our late nights in hospice, when pain kept her awake and memories were the only comfort I could offer. The pearl bracelet encircled Brittany's wrist as she gestured while talking. Dorothy wore it every Sunday to church for 43 years. Every single Sunday. I'd driven her to St. Michael's each week during those final months, watched her struggle to clasp it with shaking hands, refused her offers to just leave it home. It matters, Dorothy had said. Rituals matter when everything else is falling apart. Now it decorated the wrist of a woman who didn't know any of those stories. Could we get some of those canapés? Brittany's voice pulled me back. She was looking past me, not at me, gesturing toward my now empty tray. Of course, I said. I'll bring some right over. I returned 3 minutes later with mushroom tartlets arranged in precise circles. Brittany took one without looking at my face. The woman beside her, someone's wife, elegant and polished, took another. These are family heirlooms, Brittany said, touching the sapphire necklace. Her fingers traced the edge of the stone with casual ownership. Greg's grandmother's collection. He said they should go to someone who appreciates beautiful things. The woman made an admiring sound. They're stunning. You're so lucky. I know, Brittany said. Greg has such incredible taste. I moved away before my hands could shake. Before my careful control could fracture into something I couldn't take back. In the kitchen, I set down the empty tray and pressed my palms flat against the stainless steel counter. I thought about the photographs on my phone. Dorothy wearing each piece. Dated, documented, backed up in 3 places. I thought about the insurance paperwork Patricia had shown me. Every item listed with serial numbers, provenance, appraisal values. I thought about the repair receipt for the pearl bracelet's clasp, dated last April, signed by me when I'd taken it to Goldstein's jewelry after the clasp broke during one of Dorothy's physical therapy sessions. I thought about Greg entering Dorothy's hospital room during that final week. I need a moment alone with Mom, he'd said. I'd stepped out to talk with the hospice nurse about medication schedules. 20 minutes later, Greg emerged with his pockets weighted differently than when he'd entered. I'd known. Even then I'd known. But I'd said nothing. Documented everything. Waited. More champagne at table 8? Susan appeared beside me, her voice gentle. She saw something in my face because she added, "Are you sure you want to continue? I can have one of the regular staff take over." "I'm fine," I said, picking up a fresh tray. "Thank you." Back in the main room, Greg stood with a cluster of executives near the bar. His hand rested on Brittany's shoulder, brief, proprietary, a gesture that declared ownership to anyone watching. His eyes found mine across the room. He nodded once. Approval. I was doing what he'd asked. Being useful. Staying quiet. Supporting his success from the shadows where I belonged. I nodded back and moved to table 8. "Rachel Morrison?" The voice came from behind me, warm with recognition. I turned to find an elegant woman in her 60s, silver hair styled simply, wearing a black dress that spoke of quiet wealth. "Yes," I said, uncertain. "Margaret Cartwright." She touched my arm, her smile genuine. "You taught our Sarah. You changed her life." The world tilted slightly. Margaret Cartwright. William Cartwright's wife. The CEO's wife. "I remember Sarah," I said carefully. "She was a wonderful student. She struggled until she met you." Margaret's eyes held something I couldn't name. Recognition maybe. Or understanding. "You identified her dyslexia when she was a sophomore. Tutored her for 2 years. Helped her apply to architecture school." A man appeared beside Margaret, tall, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "William Cartwright himself. You're the teacher who spent every Tuesday and Thursday after school with our daughter," he said. Not asking. Confirming. "For 2 years. Unpaid." "It was my job," I said quietly. "No." William's voice was firm. "Your job was teaching class. What you did for Sarah was something else entirely. We've been trying to find you for years." Sarah's an architect now. She credits you with her entire career. Margaret's eyes moved from my face to the apron, then across the room to where Greg stood with his arm around Brittany. I watched understanding dawn in her expression. The kind of understanding that passes between women who've learned to read situations other people miss. Does Greg know you're serving tonight? Margaret asked, her voice carefully neutral. He asked me to help. I kept my smile in place. I wanted to support his success. Something passed between William and Margaret. A glance that held entire conversations. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Margaret's hand on my arm squeezed once, gentle and deliberate. We're glad you're here, William said finally. Then they moved away to join other guests. But I felt their awareness following me for the next hour. Watching. Noting. Understanding things I hadn't expected them to see. At 8:45, the room quieted as Greg stepped to the microphone. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began, his voice carrying that confident warmth he used for presentations. This promotion means everything to me and I'm grateful to everyone who made it possible. I stood near the kitchen doorway, my tray empty, watching. When I joined Cartwright Industries 8 years ago, Greg continued, I knew I wanted to make a difference beyond just our bottom line. I wanted to build programs that gave back to our community, that showed we care about more than profits. He was talking about my programs. The literacy initiative I'd designed during my volunteer work. The partnerships with local schools I'd built over 15 years of teaching. The family support workshops I'd created and facilitated every Saturday for 2 years. Our community outreach programs have transformed how people see this company, Greg said. We've partnered with 12 local schools, provided resources for 73 families, created pathways for students who might otherwise fall through the cracks. Every number came from my grant applications. Every success story was a family I'd worked with personally. These partnerships didn't happen overnight, he continued. They required vision, dedication, and genuine commitment to making a difference. Brittany sat at the head table, radiant. She touched the sapphire necklace, verifying its reality, basking in reflected glory. Several executives glanced toward me. Brief looks quickly hidden. I wondered if they knew. If they understood that the woman holding an empty tray had created everything their VP of Communications was claiming as his achievement. I want to thank everyone who supported this journey, Greg concluded. Your faith in me means everything. Applause filled the room. Warm. Genuine. Deserved by someone, just not by the man receiving it. I set down my tray and walked to the bathroom on legs that felt distant from my body. The mirror showed me exactly what I expected. The invisible woman. The erased wife. The teacher whose impact mattered so little that her own husband could steal credit for her work and receive applause for it. I gripped the edge of the sink and finally let myself feel it. The weight of complete erasure. The reality of standing in a room full of people while being fundamentally unseen. Dorothy's voice whispered through my memory, let truth matter more than kindness. I straightened. Smoothed my dress. Checked my reflection one more time. Then I walked back into that room with the dignity Dorothy had spent 3 years teaching me to carry. I returned to the main room with my shoulders straight and my expression carefully neutral. The party had shifted into a different gear. Louder voices, looser laughter, the third or fourth round of drinks lowering inhibitions and raising volume. I picked up a fresh water pitcher from the service station and moved between tables, refilling glasses that didn't really need refilling, staying busy, staying invisible. That's when I heard Brittany's voice cutting through the ambient noise. I honestly don't understand why people waste years in jobs that barely pay rent. I was 2 tables away, my back to her, but her voice carried with champagne-fueled confidence. Teaching, nursing, social work, she continued, and I could hear the dismissive wave in her tone even without seeing it. It's almost selfish when you think about it. Choosing low-impact careers that don't contribute to real economic growth. I turned slowly, pitcher still in hand. She sat at the head table with 3 younger executives clustered around her, all of them leaning in like she was sharing profound wisdom instead of casual cruelty. Her fingers touched the diamond earrings. Dorothy's diamond earrings. Absently, unconsciously, the way you touch something you've worn so often you forget it's there. One of the men laughed. My sister teaches elementary school. Makes $38,000 a year and complains constantly. Exactly, Brittany said, warming to her subject. Greg always says people who complain about teacher pay chose the wrong profession. If they wanted respect, they should have pursued careers that actually require strategic thinking. Strategic thinking. My hand trembled slightly as I approached their table. Just slightly. Just enough that when I poured water into the glass nearest Brittany, a single drop spilled onto the white tablecloth. Brittany glanced up. For one brief moment our eyes met. Something flickered across her face. Not recognition, she still didn't know who I was, but maybe uncertainty. Maybe a glimmer of awareness that her words had landed somewhere they shouldn't have. Then she looked away, returning to her conversation. I moved to the next table with my water pitcher in my trembling hands. I thought about the 37 thank you notes in my desk drawer at school. Parents whose children learned to read because I stayed late every Tuesday. Families who cried when their kids passed standardized tests everyone said they'd fail. I thought about Marcus's mother at last month's parent-teacher conference, tears streaming down her face when I showed her his essay on To Kill a Mockingbird. 3 pages of complex analysis from a boy who couldn't read a full sentence 2 years ago. You gave him his future, she'd whispered. Low-impact career. I thought about my master's degree in special education, completed online at 2 in the morning while Dorothy slept fitfully in the next room, while Greg slept soundly in our bedroom, while I survived on 4 hours of rest and determination. I thought about the certification programs I'd paid for myself. Learning disabilities specialist, reading intervention strategies, trauma-informed teaching practices, because Greg said professional development was wasting money on a dead-end career. Strategic thinking. I wondered if Brittany knew that the jewelry she wore with such casual entitlement had spent 40 years on the body of a woman who understood that impact can't be measured in salary. That Dorothy had valued service over status so deeply that she'd left everything to a teacher and almost nothing to her own son. Probably not. Rachel. I turned to find Margaret Cartwright standing in the hallway near the kitchen entrance, clearly waiting for me. Not asking. Waiting. I set down the water pitcher and followed her to a quiet corner near the coat check, away from the party noise and wandering guests. Margaret's face held an expression I'd seen before. On parents whose children I'd helped, whose families I'd impacted. Protective anger. The kind that rises up on behalf of someone who can't protect themselves. Patricia Hendricks is my closest friend, Margaret said without preamble. The words hit me like a physical thing. Patricia. Dorothy's attorney. The woman I'd been meeting monthly at a diner 40 minutes from town. She handles William's personal legal matters, Margaret continued, her voice low and steady. She mentioned a case that troubled her deeply. A woman who sacrificed years caring for her dying mother-in-law while the son neglected his own mother. A woman who inherited everything because the mother saw her son's true character before she died. My breath caught in my throat. Patricia didn't mention names, Margaret said, meeting my eyes. But I've known about Greg's affair for 6 weeks. I saw them at Caruso's downtown. Him with a young woman, very cozy, very public. I asked Patricia to look into Greg's background. The hallway felt smaller suddenly. William's company does routine background checks, Margaret explained. But somehow Greg's credentials were never thoroughly verified when he was hired 8 years ago. So I asked Patricia to dig deeper. He paused, letting that sink in. His MBA was never completed. He enrolled at Kellogg in 2015. Dropped out after 1 semester. No degree was ever awarded. I already knew this. Patricia had shown me the documentation weeks ago. But hearing Margaret say it out loud, hearing someone else confirm the lie Greg had built his entire career on, made it more real somehow. The community outreach work he's been claiming, Margaret continued, those programs match exactly, word for word in some cases, the initiatives described in grant applications at the Riverside Literacy Center. Applications signed by Rachel Morrison, volunteer coordinator. The world felt like it was expanding and contracting at the same time. Too big. Too small. Too much information pressing in from all sides. William is speaking at midnight, Margaret said gently. Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that some people see truth even when others choose blindness. Dorothy made sure you had resources. Now let others help you use them. She squeezed my arm once, a gesture that carried more weight than words, then returned to the party. I stood alone in the hallway, processing what had just shifted. Patricia hadn't just been protecting me. She'd been building a network, creating allies. Dorothy hadn't just left me money. She'd left me connections. I returned to the service area with my thoughts spinning, trying to appear busy, trying to stay invisible just a little bit longer. You're doing great. Greg's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his face flushed from alcohol and triumph, his tie slightly loosened. Really great, he repeated, with the kind of condescending approval you'd give a dog who'd learned to sit on command. Brittany mentioned you spilled water at table 6, though. Try to be more careful. These people matter for my career. I looked at him. Really looked at him. The man I'd tutored through college English because he couldn't parse complex sentences in Victorian literature. The man who'd proposed after I helped him pass his final exams, who'd needed my stability to balance his chaotic ambitions. The man who'd slowly, methodically transformed me from partner to servant because his fabricated success required someone to diminish. I could say so many things in this moment. I could tell him about Dorothy's will. About the $2 million sitting in my name. About the house he thought he'd inherited that actually belonged to me. I could tell him about his credentials. About Patricia's investigation. About William knowing the truth. I could tell him that in less than an hour, everything he'd built on lies was going to collapse in front of 50 witnesses. The old Rachel would have stayed silent. Would have avoided confrontation. Would have preserved peace at any cost because peace was safer than truth. But standing in this service corridor wearing an apron over Dorothy's dress, I discovered that silence has different shapes. Some silence is defeat. Some silence is strategy. I'll be more careful, I said, meeting his eyes with an expression I knew he couldn't quite read. Something in my tone made him pause. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before his confidence reassembled itself, before he convinced himself he'd imagined whatever he'd heard in my voice. Good, he said. We're almost done here. Just get through the next hour. He returned to the party. I stood alone thinking about hours and endings and the way some performances conclude exactly as they should. I removed my apron. Smoothed Dorothy's gray dress. Checked my reflection in the small mirror near the service entrance. The woman looking back at me wasn't invisible anymore. I returned to the main room just as guests began gathering near the front, sensing something was about to happen. Mrs. Morrison? A young woman approached me near the bar, mid-20s, professional, with an architect's practical elegance and a warmth in her eyes that felt familiar. I'm Sarah Cartwright, she said tentatively. You probably don't remember me. But I did. Silly. The terrified sophomore who'd stayed after class in tears, convinced she was stupid, unable to read aloud without panic. Sarah, I said, and her whole face transformed with relief that I remembered. I had dyslexia, she continued quickly, like she needed to explain herself. Couldn't read out loud. Spent most of 10th grade convinced I'd never graduate. You graduated with honors, I said. Got into 3 architecture programs. Her smile was radiant. Because of you. You identified what was wrong. You tutored me for 2 years. You helped me apply to schools when my guidance counselor said I shouldn't bother. She glanced across the room at Greg, at Brittany beside him wearing Dorothy's jewelry. My parents told me about tonight's setup, Sarah said quietly. About you serving. About her sitting at the head table. I wanted you to know that some students remember who saved them. My throat felt tight. My dad asked me to be here for his toast, Sarah added. He said it was important. He said I'd understand why. He squeezed my hand. I think you will too. She moved away to join her parents near the front of the room. And I stood there, understanding finally that tonight wasn't just about Greg's exposure. It was about recognition. About being seen. About Dorothy's gift of patience yielding returns I'd never calculated. The clock on the wall read 11:55 p.m. I watched William Cartwright stand, lifting his glass with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to demand attention. It simply commands it. 50 conversations stopped mid-sentence. I positioned myself near the back wall where I'd been invisible all evening, my hands empty now, no tray to hold, no pitcher to carry, nothing to justify my presence except that I was here. That's when I noticed them. Margaret stood near the entrance, her silver hair catching the light. Patricia had moved to the side near the windows. Sarah stood to my left, maybe 15 feet away. They'd formed a perimeter around the room. Strategic positions. Coordinated. This wasn't accidental. At the head table, Greg beamed. Brittany's hand rested on his arm, proprietary and comfortable. The sapphire necklace caught the chandelier light like a claim staked publicly for everyone to see. "Thank you all for being here tonight," William began, his voice warm and genuine. "We gather to celebrate achievement, and achievement certainly deserves recognition." Greg's smile widened. He straightened slightly in his chair. "But achievement has many forms," William continued, his tone shifting subtly. "We celebrate those who rise within corporate structures, certainly. Promotions matter. Professional advancement matters." He paused, letting the room settle into the silence. "But we should also acknowledge those whose work happens quietly, whose impact ripples through communities in ways that can't be measured in quarterly reports or annual reviews." My heartbeat accelerated. Something in his phrasing, in the deliberate way he was building this moment. "Before we toast Greg's professional advancement," William said, "I want to share a personal story about education's transformative power." The room had gone completely still. 50 people leaning in slightly, curious where this was heading. Greg's expression showed pleased anticipation. He thought this prologue served his glory. That William was building toward praising him. Brittany adjusted the diamond earrings. Dorothy's diamond earrings, preening slightly. And I understood with sudden crystalline certainty that the next 10 minutes were going to dismantle everything Greg had built. "My daughter Sarah," William said, gesturing toward where she stood, "struggled through elementary and middle school." Sarah stepped forward slightly, her face showing emotion carefully controlled. "Teachers said she wasn't trying hard enough," William continued, his voice thickening. "That she was lazy. That she'd never succeed academically. By sophomore year she believed them. I remembered that girl. Terrified. Convinced she was broken. She was failing English," William said. "Convinced she was stupid. Planning to drop out at 16. The room was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. Then she met a teacher who saw what others missed." My throat tightened. A teacher who spent her planning period researching dyslexia. Who stayed after school twice a week for 2 years. Unpaid, tutoring Sarah. Teaching her to advocate for herself. Helping her discover that her brain wasn't broken, just different. I remembered those afternoons. Sarah crying over words that wouldn't make sense. The breakthrough moment when she read an entire page without stopping. The college acceptance letter we opened together in my classroom. "That teacher never asked for recognition," William said, his eyes scanning the room. "Never sought credit. She did the work because she believed one student's life mattered." His gaze found mine across the distance. Today, Sarah is a licensed architect specializing in accessible design. She's helped create learning spaces for thousands of students with disabilities. Her entire career exists because one teacher cared enough to see beyond test scores. The room shifted. People turning slightly, following William's eyeline, trying to figure out who he was talking about. "Rachel Morrison," William said clearly, "would you please come forward?" The floor felt unstable beneath my feet. I walked toward the front on legs that felt distant from my body, aware of 50 pairs of eyes tracking my movement. Aware of Greg's face draining of color as he understood that his wife, the invisible server, the dismissed teacher, the woman he'd ordered to help with service, was the subject of William's story. Brittany's hand moved unconsciously to the sapphire necklace, confusion replacing her earlier confidence. When I reached the front, William's hand settled on my shoulder. Warm, steady, grounding. "Rachel taught my daughter," he said, addressing the room. "She's taught hundreds of students during her 15 years at Lincoln High. She specializes in identifying learning disabilities that other teachers miss." I could feel the weight of attention. The shift in the room's energy. "She volunteers every weekend at the Riverside Literacy Center," William continued, "creating programs that have taught 73 adults to read in the past 3 years. His voice hardened slightly. Just slightly. But enough. Some of you in this room may recognize those programs. Greg had gone very still. They've been featured in Cartwright Industries community outreach presentations. They've been cited in our corporate social responsibility reports. They've helped secure client contracts by demonstrating our commitment to education. The silence felt like pressure building. Those programs, William said clearly, were created by Rachel Morrison. Not by our marketing department. The partnerships with local schools, the tutoring initiatives, the literacy workshops. All Rachel's work. documented in grant applications she submitted years before Cartwright Industries claimed partnership credit. The room's energy shifted instantly. Executives glancing at Greg. Confusion. Dawning understanding. Discomfort. Greg's face had gone from pale to gray. "I asked Rachel here tonight," William said, his hand still on my shoulder, "because her husband Greg is being recognized for community outreach achievements. It seemed appropriate that the woman who actually created those achievements should be present." Brittany had removed her hand from Greg's arm. Margaret Cartwright rose from her position near the entrance, moving to stand on my other side with the bearing of someone accustomed to charitable leadership, to making announcements that mattered. "My husband and I," Margaret said, her voice clear and firm, "have established the Dorothy Morrison Memorial Education Initiative." Dorothy's name. Spoken publicly. In front of 50 people. In front of Greg. "A $500,000 endowment," Margaret continued, "dedicated to identifying and supporting students with learning disabilities in our school district." My knees felt weak. The amount. The purpose. Dorothy's name attached to it. "Rachel Morrison will serve as program director," Margaret announced, "at an annual salary of $95,000, with full benefits and research budget." 95,000. More than I'd made in 15 years of teaching. More than Greg had ever suggested I was worth. "Dorothy Morrison," Margaret said, and something in her voice made the room lean in, "spent her final years watching her son neglect his mother while his wife provided care with extraordinary devotion." Greg's face showed something close to panic now. She witnessed Rachel sacrifice career advancement, personal time, and her own well-being to ensure Dorothy's final months had dignity. I could feel tears threatening but refused to let them fall. "Dorothy told me personally," Margaret said, looking directly at Greg, 6 weeks before her death, that Rachel was the daughter she wished she'd had. The silence was absolute. "This foundation will employ 4 full-time specialists," Margaret concluded. "It will provide free testing and tutoring. It will partner with schools across 3 districts. It launches January 2nd. Rachel's letter of acceptance is already signed." She paused, then added with pointed precision, "We trust Cartwright Industries will support this initiative, given your documented commitment to education outreach." The implication hung in the air. The challenge barely veiled. Greg sat frozen at the head table. Brittany had shifted away from him slightly, her body language suddenly uncertain. Around the room, executives were exchanging glances. Quiet conversations starting. The energy completely transformed from celebration to something else. Something that felt like accountability arriving uninvited to a party that had been built on convenient fiction. William's hand squeezed my shoulder once. "Dorothy Morrison left a remarkable legacy," he said to the room. "Not just in resources but in recognizing where real value lies. In people who serve quietly. Who sacrifice without seeking credit. Who understand that impact can't be measured in quarterly reports." His eyes found Greg's across the distance. "Some legacies are built on truth," William said. "And some are built on borrowed glory." The distinction was clear. The judgment was implicit. And standing there between William and Margaret, with Sarah watching from the side and Patricia near the windows, I understood that Dorothy hadn't just left me money. She'd left me allies. She'd left me protection. She'd left me a way forward that I couldn't have built alone. Before Greg could respond, before he could formulate whatever defense or deflection was forming behind his panic-stricken eyes, another woman stood. Patricia Hendricks. She rose from a table near the back with the deliberate composure of someone who'd spent 3 decades practicing estate law, whose silver hair and steady bearing carried authority that didn't need to announce itself. "I'm Patricia Hendricks," she said, her voice cutting through the charged silence. "Dorothy Morrison's attorney for 31 years. I handled her estate after her death 3 months ago." I watched Greg's face cycle through emotions like pages turning too fast. Confusion. Why was his mother's lawyer here? Calculation. What did this mean for him? Then creeping horror as understanding began to dawn. "Dorothy Morrison changed her will 6 months before her death," Patricia said, each word precisely measured. "After her Parkinson's diagnosis made clear she had limited time remaining." Greg's hands gripped the edge of the table. "She was mentally sound," Patricia continued. "I had 3 physicians document her capacity. Her instructions were explicit." Patricia removed a folder from her bag. the same folder I'd seen across diner tables for 3 months. The gesture was somehow both theatrical and matter-of-fact, the movement of someone who'd done this 1,000 times but understood the weight of this particular moment. Greg Morrison inherited $25,000 and his father's watch collection, Patricia said clearly. Items specified in Dorothy's original will from 1997. The remainder of the estate, including the family home valued at $465,000, the investment portfolio currently worth $1.3 million, and all personal property, was left entirely to Rachel Morrison. The room erupted. Not loud, exactly, but the sudden rush of whispered conversations created a wall of sound that felt deafening. Greg stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, nearly tipping backward. "That's impossible," he said, his voice too loud, his control fracturing visibly. "My mother left everything to me. I've been managing the estate since she died. I've been handling everything." "You've been managing what you believed was your inheritance," Patricia said, her expression unchanged, professional. "The estate was never in your name, Greg. Rachel hasn't claimed anything yet because I advised her to wait until certain matters resolved themselves." The implications settled over the room like a physical weight. Greg had been living in a house that wasn't his, managing money that didn't belong to him, giving away jewelry he had no right to touch. Patricia's gaze shifted to Brittany, who had instinctively covered the sapphire necklace with her hand, her face draining of color. "Those pieces you're wearing," Patricia said, her tone still professional but carrying an edge now. "The sapphire necklace, the diamond earrings, the pearl bracelet, they belonged to Dorothy Morrison. They're listed specifically in her will as part of the estate bequeathed to Rachel Morrison." Brittany's hand trembled against the necklace. "We have detailed descriptions," Patricia continued. "Serial numbers engraved inside the settings. Insurance documentation. Photographs from Dorothy's personal collection showing her wearing each piece over 40 years. She looked at Greg. "Those items were removed from Dorothy's room during her final hospitalization. Rachel documented their theft but chose not to pursue charges immediately, believing family matters should be resolved privately." "Greg said they were gifts," Brittany stammered, her hands fumbling with the necklace clasp. "He said they were family heirlooms. He said I didn't know." Her voice had gone high and panicked. The clasp wouldn't release. Her fingers shook too badly to manage the small mechanism. Margaret moved smoothly from where she'd been standing, crossing to Brittany with practiced ease, helping with the clasp without drama, without judgment, just efficient competence. The necklace came free. Then the earrings. Then the bracelet. Margaret collected each piece carefully, handling them like the precious items they were. "These will be returned to Rachel," Margaret said quietly but clearly enough for the room to hear. "If there are other items, we trust they'll be returned immediately to avoid criminal complications." Brittany nodded frantically, pulling rings off her fingers that I hadn't even noticed before. A gold band. A small jade piece. Each one landing in Margaret's hand like evidence being catalogued. "The pearl bracelet," Patricia said, her tone remaining steady and professional, "has a repair receipt dated April 15th of this year. Signed by Rachel Morrison when the clasp broke. The diamond earrings have provenance documentation tracing them to 1923 Ireland. The sapphire necklace's interior engraving reads, 'To Dorothy Brennan, 40 years of love, James Morrison, 1982. Dorothy's maiden name and her anniversary year.'" He paused, letting that sink in. "These aren't generic heirlooms. They're documented property with clear ownership records." William Cartwright reclaimed the floor, his earlier warmth completely replaced by corporate authority. The CO addressing a personnel matter, not a friend making a toast. "When Margaret alerted me to concerns about Greg's background 6 weeks ago," William said, removing his own folder from inside his jacket, "I ordered a comprehensive credential verification. Something I regret wasn't done more thoroughly during initial hiring 8 years ago." Greg's face had gone from gray to almost green. Greg Morrison's resume claims an MBA from Kellogg School of Management, completed in 2015, William said, reading from the folder. "Our verification found enrollment records for 1 semester in 2015. Withdrawal documented in December of that year. No degree was awarded." "I can explain," Greg started. "The community outreach initiatives you've claimed authorship of," William continued, speaking over him, Match word for word in some cases with grant applications submitted by Rachel Morrison to the Riverside Literacy Center between 2019 and 2023. He flipped a page. Statistical outcomes in your presentations. 73 adults taught to read, 42 families served, partnerships with 12 local schools. These numbers appear in Rachel's volunteer coordinator reports. With her signature, her contact information, her detailed documentation of results. William looked up from the folder, meeting Greg's eyes directly. You built your career on stolen credentials and your wife's volunteer work, he said, his voice hard. Every presentation you gave, every promotion you received, every client you impressed, all of it based on lies and plagiarism. The room's energy had shifted completely. What had been celebration an hour ago now felt hostile. Several executives were standing, moving away from Greg's table as if proximity carried contagion. Greg Morrison's employment with Cartwright Industries is terminated effective immediately, William said, his voice taking on the formal tone of corporate decisions already made. Human Resources will contact you Monday regarding final compensation and exit procedures. Security will escort you from the premises momentarily. 2 security officers appeared at the room's entrance. Their presence clearly prearranged. They'd been waiting. Greg's face cycled through disbelief, then rage, then something closer to animal panic. You can't do this, he said, his voice breaking. I've given 8 years to this company. 8 years of my life. You've given 8 years of fraud, William interrupted sharply. You falsified credentials on your employment application, which constitutes grounds for immediate termination. You claimed credit for work you didn't create, which violates our professional ethics standards. You used company resources to promote fabricated achievements. He paused, then added with cold finality. Cartwright Industries will not file criminal charges regarding credential fraud if you leave quietly. That's more mercy than you've shown anyone tonight. I watched my husband's public destruction with an emotion I couldn't name. Not satisfaction exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter. Something like closure. Like watching a debt balance finally reach zero after years of accumulating interest. Greg turned to me, his face showing betrayal. As if I'd orchestrated this. As if my silence about Dorothy's will had been conspiracy rather than patience, rather than survival. You knew, he said, accusatory, his voice loud enough to carry. You knew about the inheritance and you let me think. I spoke for the first time since William had begun his toast. I knew what Dorothy chose to give me, I said quietly, but my voice carried in the silence. I knew what you chose to steal. And I knew that truth would matter more than my timing. The security officers moved forward. Greg looked around the room, at executives who wouldn't meet his eyes, at Brittany who'd shifted her chair away from him, at 50 people who'd been celebrating his success an hour ago and now watched his exposure with something between horror and fascination. This isn't over, he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. Yes, Patricia said calmly from the back of the room. It is. The security officers reached Greg's table. And my husband, my soon-to-be ex-husband, was escorted from his own promotion party while I stood at the front of the room wearing Dorothy's gray dress, surrounded by the allies she'd given me, holding the future she'd made possible. The security officers guided Greg toward the exit, his protests echoing down the hallway, indignant denials that grew fainter with distance until they disappeared entirely. Silence settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Brittany remained standing near the head table, stripped of jewelry, her emerald cocktail dress suddenly looking costume-like without Dorothy's sapphires and diamonds to lend it borrowed elegance. Her makeup had started to run, mascara streaking down her cheeks. She approached me with hesitant steps, tears streaming openly now. All of her earlier confidence evaporated. I didn't know, she said, her voice breaking. Please, you have to believe me. I didn't know. I stood motionless, watching her unravel, feeling nothing close to what I'd expected. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just a strange, weary recognition. Greg told me his mother left him everything, Brittany continued, words tumbling out desperately. He said the jewelry was his to give. He said you were separated, that you'd both agreed to divorce, that you knew about us and didn't care. Margaret intercepted her gently but firmly, placing a hand on Brittany's arm and steering her toward a quieter corner away from the remaining guests who were pretending not to watch. I followed, more from momentum than decision. He showed me the house, Brittany was saying, her voice high and panicked. He said it was his mother's house that he inherited. He gave me keys. He said we'd live there together after the divorce. I really thought. Patricia joined us, her presence creating a formal triangle. Legal authority arriving to contain the situation. The jewelry theft charges depend on Rachel's decision, Patricia said, addressing Brittany directly with professional detachment. If you cooperate fully, returning any other items Greg gave you, providing a written statement about his claims regarding the estate, confirming the timeline of your relationship, Rachel may choose not to pursue criminal prosecution. Yes, Brittany said immediately, frantically. Anything. I'll do anything. She started pulling rings off her fingers, pieces I hadn't even noticed before in the chaos of the evening. A gold band with a small stone. A jade piece set in silver. She emptied her purse onto the table. Dorothy's reading glasses in their worn leather case. A small jade figurine I recognized from Dorothy's nightstand. A gold pen engraved with DM 1975. Dorothy's initials and the year she'd started her teaching career before marriage. Each item landed on the table like evidence being catalogued. Like pieces of Dorothy being returned one by one. I'll give back everything, Brittany whispered. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just thought. She didn't finish, but I understood. He thought she was trading up. Escaping her own limitations through proximity to perceived success. She'd gambled her integrity on a man whose achievements existed only in presentation slides and fabricated credentials. She was 28. Ambitious. Willing to overlook inconsistencies because the alternative meant admitting she'd made a terrible mistake. Greg's accomplice and his victim simultaneously. I felt no triumph in watching her humiliation. Just exhaustion. We'll need that written statement by Monday, Patricia said. Everything Greg told you about the inheritance, the house, the jewelry, his marriage. All of it documented. Brittany nodded, wiping her eyes, smearing her makeup further. Margaret handed her a tissue. There's a washroom down the hall. Take a moment to collect yourself. After Brittany left, Margaret turned to me. Are you all right? I didn't know how to answer that. An hour later, most of the guests had departed with the awkward energy of people who'd witnessed something they couldn't quite categorize. Not quite a celebration. Not quite a scandal. Something in between. William asked me to join him in the club's library. A small wood-paneled room lined with books that probably no one read, leather chairs arranged around a fireplace that wasn't lit. Margaret, Patricia, and Sarah were already there when I entered. The intimate gathering felt like a war council convening after battle. I want to apologize, William began. I started to protest. Why was he apologizing? But he held up his hand. I employed Greg for 8 years without verifying his credentials properly, he said. I created an environment where he could steal credit for your work because I didn't ask enough questions about where our community outreach programs actually originated. If I'd been more thorough 8 years ago, tonight wouldn't have been necessary. He looked at me with something like regret. Dorothy contacted Margaret 2 months before she died, he continued. She was worried about you. About how Greg would react to being disinherited. About whether you'd be safe when the truth emerged. Margaret picked up the thread. She asked us to watch for opportunities to help you. To create distance between you and Greg before the inheritance became public knowledge. I absorbed this slowly. Tonight hadn't been spontaneous. Dorothy's protection had extended beyond financial security into strategic allies, coordinated intervention, carefully timed revelations. The foundation is real, Margaret said. We've been planning it for 6 months. But we specifically wanted Greg's promotion party as the venue for the announcement. We wanted him to reach what he'd consider his professional peak, William added quietly, before he understood what he'd actually lost. Not just the inheritance, but his wife's respect, his colleagues' trust, his mother's love. The manipulation's scope was staggering. The careful coordination required to engineer tonight's revelations. The strategic timing. The allies positioned around the room. The security officers waiting for their cue. All of it orchestrated. All of it decided. Without asking me what I wanted. I appreciate everything you've done, I said carefully, trying to find words that were honest without being ungrateful. Dorothy's gift. the inheritance, the foundation, the protection. It's more than I ever expected. But, Margaret prompted gently. But I'm not sure I wanted it this way, I admitted. I wanted Greg to face consequences. I wanted recognition for my work. I wanted justice. I paused, trying to articulate something I was only beginning to understand myself. But I didn't want it orchestrated. I didn't want to be someone's proof of concept. Someone's perfect victim who gets rescued by powerful allies who've been planning interventions without asking if that's what I needed. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable exactly. Just honest. You're right, Patricia said finally. We should have involved you more in the planning. We should have asked what you wanted rather than assuming we knew what was best. Dorothy meant well, Margaret added. We all meant well. But good intentions don't excuse taking control of someone's life, even with their best interests at heart. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. The foundation is yours to accept or decline, William said. The position is real, the funding is real, but if you don't want it, if you want to chart your own path without our involvement, we'll respect that. I want it, I said immediately, because that much I knew for certain. The work matters. The students matter. That part isn't about Greg or revenge or justice. That's about doing something that actually makes a difference. Sarah, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. But you need time to figure out what else you want. Beyond the work. Beyond what Dorothy planned or what my parents orchestrated. I nodded, grateful she understood. At 2 a.m., I found myself alone in the country club's powder room while the others handled final logistics. Paperwork for the foundation, arrangements for Monday's follow-up meetings, coordination with building security about Greg being banned from the premises. I looked at myself in the ornate mirror above the marble sink. The woman staring back was vindicated. Financially secured. Professionally elevated. Everything Dorothy had wanted for me. Everything Greg had tried to prevent. But I felt hollowed out. Like tonight's victory had extracted something essential I hadn't agreed to sacrifice. I thought about Greg's face when Patricia revealed the inheritance. The genuine shock. He'd truly believed he'd inherited everything. His theft of the jewelry had been casual entitlement, not calculated crime. I thought about Brittany crying, 28 years old and facing professional ruin for believing a liar's promises. And I wondered if revenge, even justified revenge, even revenge orchestrated by people who loved me, had left me in a place I actually wanted to inhabit. My phone buzzed. 17 missed calls from Greg. 12 voicemails I wouldn't listen to. Text messages alternating between rage and pleading. You manipulated my mother. This isn't over. Please call me, we can fix this. You'll regret this. I'm sorry, just please talk to me. I blocked his number with mechanical precision, watching his contact disappear from my screen. Then I sat on the closed toilet lid and finally allowed myself to cry. Not from relief or triumph, but from the exhausting weight of being Dorothy's champion. William's proof of concept. Patricia's perfectly patient client. I'd wanted justice. I'd wanted recognition. I'd wanted Greg to understand what he'd destroyed. I'd gotten all of it. And now, at 2 a.m. in an empty bathroom, I had to figure out what version of myself survived success. The door opened softly. Sarah's voice. Rachel? I looked up, knowing my makeup was smudged, knowing Dorothy's gray dress was wrinkled beyond repair from tonight's performance. Sarah sat beside me on the antique settee without speaking at first. Just present. The way I'd once been present for a terrified 10th grader who thought she was stupid. Finally she spoke. When I got my architecture license, she said, I had this moment where I realized I was exactly who you told me I could be. But I didn't know who that person was yet. Like I'd been working so hard to become successful that I forgot to figure out what success would actually feel like. She looked at me with understanding that went deeper than sympathy. Tonight everyone saw what Greg did to you. What he stole. What he lied about. And they saw you get everything back. Inheritance, recognition, career opportunity. She paused. But I watched your face during William's toast. You weren't happy. You were just done. I felt seen in a way I hadn't been all night. I thought I wanted this, I admitted. I wanted Greg to face consequences. But now it's happened and I just feel tired. Sarah nodded. Because revenge doesn't heal anything. It just stops the bleeding long enough to see the wound clearly. She took my hand. My parents meant well tonight. Dorothy meant well with the inheritance. But they gave you justice, not healing. That part, figuring out who Rachel Morrison is after she stops being Greg's victim, that's your work, not theirs. I sat with that truth. Tonight's exposure was an ending, not a resolution. Whatever came next, I'd have to build it myself from the rubble of a marriage that had ended years before tonight's formal execution. Sunday morning arrived with pale winter light filtering through the country club's tall windows as I said goodbye to Sarah, Margaret, William, and Patricia in the parking lot. "Call if you need anything," Margaret said, squeezing my hand. "Anything at all." I drove back through town in my 11-year-old Honda, the same car I'd driven to the party, but somehow the streets looked different. Unfamiliar. Like I'd been gone for months instead of hours. I didn't go to the house Greg and I shared. The house where I'd slept in the guest bedroom for 8 months, where his instructions and criticisms lived in every room. I went to Dorothy's house instead. My house now. Wiggly. Officially. For 3 months. But standing in the driveway at 9 a.m. on a Sunday, looking at the modest 3-bedroom Craftsman with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, I felt like I was trespassing. Patricia met me there with keys and paperwork, deed transfer, insurance policies, utility accounts already changed to my name. She handed everything over with quiet ceremony, like passing me something sacred. "It's yours," she said simply. "Dorothy wanted you to have a home." The front door stuck slightly when I unlocked it. Everything inside was exactly as I'd left it 3 months ago, the day after Dorothy's funeral when Greg had insisted on going through his mother's things without me present. The house still smelled like her. Lavender sachets tucked into drawers. The ghost of lemon cookies she'd baked every Sunday before Parkinson's stole her hand coordination. Old books. Gentle decline. Memory made physical. I stood in the living room and couldn't move. My possessions sat in the Honda's trunk and back seat. 12 years of marriage reduced to 3 suitcases, 2 boxes of books, and a plastic bin containing cards from students and photos Greg wouldn't allow displayed. That was everything I'd taken from our house early this morning while Greg was presumably still at his brother's apartment, before he knew about last night, before the inevitable confrontation. I started unpacking slowly. My clothes went into Dorothy's dresser, hanging in her closet beside dresses she'd worn to church, sweaters she'd loved, a life carefully preserved. My toiletries lined up in her bathroom. My books stacked on her shelves. I felt like a guest inhabiting someone else's life. Like I was playing house in a museum. The master bedroom still contained her bed, her nightstand with reading glasses and a devotional book, her closet full of clothes I couldn't imagine discarding. Too much Dorothy. Too much presence. I slept in the guest room instead. White walls, generic furniture, nothing personal. And I dreamed Dorothy was asking me whether I was brave enough to actually live in freedom or just occupy its physical space. Monday morning I woke to pounding on the front door. Aggressive. Insistent. The kind of knocking that demanded attention. I checked my phone. 6:07 a.m. Greg's voice came through the door loud enough to carry down the street. "Rachel, open this door. This is my mother's house. You can't keep me out of my own house." I stood in the hallway, heart pounding, and pulled out my phone to record. "This house belongs to me," I said through the door, keeping my voice steady. "You're trespassing. Leave or I'll call the police. You manipulated my mother." Greg shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "You conspired with her lawyer to forge documents. You seduced my boss to target me. You destroyed my career." Each accusation more desperate than the last. Through the window I could see neighbors emerging onto porches. Mrs. Patterson across the street. The Johnsons 2 doors down. All watching. "I'm calling the police," I said, already dialing the non-emergency line. "This isn't over." Greg yelled. "You think you can steal everything from me? You think you can just—" "Police non-emergency," the dispatcher answered. I described the situation calmly while Greg continued shouting. Gave the address. Confirmed I was safe inside but wanted him removed from the property. "An officer will be there in 15 minutes, the dispatcher said. I waited, phone still recording, while Greg's shouts deteriorated into incoherent rage mixed with pleading. The neighbors watched. The morning grew brighter. And I stood inside Dorothy's house. My house. Refusing entry to the man who'd spent 12 years teaching me to make myself smaller. The patrol car arrived 14 minutes later. Officer Martinez. Young, professional patient. listened to both of us, checked the deed documentation I provided, issued Greg a warning about harassment. If he returns or contacts you again, Officer Martinez said, handing me a card with a case number, you should consider a restraining order. After they left, Greg driven away by his brother who'd arrived to collect him, I sat on Dorothy's porch shaking from adrenaline. But beneath the shaking was something else. Something unexpected. I'd refused Greg entry. Called the police on my own husband. Enforced boundaries with legal intervention instead of accommodation. For 12 years I'd absorbed his demands, minimized my needs, maintained peace at any cost. This morning I'd chosen differently. The line between victim and agent had shifted slightly. Patricia called at noon. I'm filing for a temporary restraining order. We have enough documentation. The harassment, the jewelry theft, the financial control patterns. Can you come to my office at 2? By 5 p.m. the temporary order was approved. Greg would be served at his brother's apartment. 500 feet minimum distance from me, my home, my workplace, my vehicle. No contact by any means. I felt the protection as both relief and loss. I'd wanted boundaries, not warfare. But apparently warfare was required to establish boundaries with men who'd never recognized them. Tuesday I returned to Lincoln High for the first time since the party. Walking into my classroom felt surreal, like returning to a life I'd left years ago instead of days. Flowers sat on my desk. A beautiful arrangement with a card. Thank you for transforming my life when I thought I was hopeless. With gratitude, Sarah Cartwright. My students would see them. Would ask questions. Would know something significant had happened. Jennifer found me during morning break. Rachel, I'm so sorry. I saw them together months ago and I should have said something more direct. I should have. It's okay, I said, meaning it. You couldn't have changed anything. Mrs. Chun called me to her office at lunch. Not for reprimand, for coffee and quiet conversation about what I needed. Time off. Modified schedule. Counseling referrals. The literacy coordinator position is still available, she said carefully. But maybe that conversation waits until you're ready. I taught 3 classes that day with reduced capacity, my mind fractured between present students and last week's exposure. But I found unexpected grounding in the routine. Lesson plans. Guiding struggling readers through complex texts. Work that mattered regardless of personal chaos. My AP English students gave me a card signed by all 23 of them. Best teacher ever. We're proud of you. They didn't know details. Just rumors about dramatic party events. But their loyalty touched something raw. After school, Marcus stayed behind. The dyslexic junior whose thank you note from his mother had sat on my desk last Friday morning. A lifetime ago. Ms. Morrison, he said shyly, my mom wanted me to tell you that whatever you're going through, you're the bravest person we know. I cried. In front of a student. For the first time in 15 years. And Marcus awkwardly patted my shoulder, understanding that sometimes adults need the same grace he'd received when he couldn't read aloud without panic. Thursday evening, I drove to William and Margaret's home for my first planning meeting for the Dorothy Morrison Memorial Education Initiative. Their house was elegant but comfortable, built-in bookshelves overflowing with actual books people actually read. Family photos showing Sarah's progression from struggling teenager to confident architect, furniture chosen for comfort rather than display. Also present, 2 special education consultants, the Riverside Literacy Center director, and a grant writer named Amanda who'd helped Margaret establish the foundation's legal structure. For 2 hours we discussed vision. Free comprehensive testing for students K-12 showing signs of learning disabilities. Small group tutoring 5 afternoons weekly. Parent education workshops. Teacher training on recognition and accommodation strategies. The budget allowed for 4 full-time staff initially. My director position focused on program development and community partnership. It was everything I'd dreamed about during late nights grading papers. During conversations with frustrated parents whose children fell through system cracks. During volunteer hours that Greg dismissed as hobby rather than calling. But sitting in Margaret's living room discussing my $95,000 salary, more than I'd earned in 15 years of teaching, I felt imposter syndrome settle like weight on my chest. I'm a teacher, I said quietly during a pause in the conversation. I don't have nonprofit management experience. Foundation leadership background. Are you certain I'm qualified? Margaret's response was immediate and firm. You're qualified because you've done this work for free for 15 years with no support. Now you'll do it with resources, staff, and institutional backing. That's not a different job. That's the same job done properly. William added, Sarah struggled until you intervened. How many other Sarahs are sitting in classrooms right now? Convinced they're stupid. Headed toward dropping out. This foundation exists because you proved one teacher can change trajectory. Now you'll train others to replicate that impact. I absorbed this, understanding finally what accepting Dorothy's gift actually meant. Not just receiving money or recognition or career advancement, but accepting responsibility for multiplying it. For honoring Dorothy's faith by becoming the leader she'd apparently seen beneath the diminished wife Greg had created. The meeting ended at 9. I drove home to Dorothy's house, my house, through dark streets. And for the first time since the party, I felt something close to certainty about what came next. I pulled into my driveway that Thursday night feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Anticipation instead of dread about what waited inside. The house was mine now. Not legally, I'd known that for months. But emotionally, actually mine. I'd started making changes. Small ones at first. Moving furniture. Hanging artwork my students had given me over the years. Pieces Greg had said were too childish for our home. Painting the guest bedroom a soft blue that reminded me of the ocean. And I'd finally moved into the master bedroom. Dorothy's bed. Dorothy's nightstand. Dorothy's closet where I'd carefully packed her clothes and donated them to the church thrift shop she'd loved, keeping only a few pieces that still carried her scent. Felt like permission. Like she was saying it was okay to actually live here instead of just occupying space. January 2nd, the Dorothy Morrison Memorial Education Initiative opened its doors. The renovated storefront sat 2 blocks from Lincoln High, close enough that I could see my old classroom windows from our front entrance. 2 large tutoring rooms with natural light and comfortable furniture. A testing office with assessment materials and one-way observation glass. A small library stocked with audiobooks and assistive technology. A parent resource center with coffee and information and the kind of welcome that said, "You're not alone in this." I hired carefully over December. 2 special education specialists with master's degrees who understood that credentials meant nothing without compassion. A bilingual family liaison named Maria who'd grown up with undiagnosed dyslexia and knew firsthand what we were trying to prevent. A program coordinator named James who handled logistics while I focused on the educational design that had lived in my head for 15 years. Our first month we served 18 students. By March we were at capacity with 47 students and a waiting list that grew daily. I developed assessment protocols based on what I'd learned over 15 years of teaching. The subtle signs other teachers missed, the patterns that indicated specific disabilities, the questions that revealed struggles kids had learned to hide. I visited 5 schools weekly, conducting workshops for teachers who wanted to learn but hadn't had training. Building relationships with counselors who needed somewhere to send families when they recognized problems beyond their capacity to address. The local newspaper ran a feature in February, New Foundation Honors Teacher's Legacy. They mentioned Dorothy's gift, William's founding donation, my expertise. They didn't mention Greg. He'd become absence. A footnote erased from the narrative. Exactly as he'd tried to erase me. Parents started showing up with children who reminded me of younger Sarah. Bright kids convinced they were failing. Terrified teenagers who'd learned to hide their struggles so well even their parents didn't know. Families desperate for help they couldn't afford. One mother, her name was Christine, cried during our intake interview when I explained that dyslexia wasn't stupidity, just different neurological processing. "Nobody ever told us that," she whispered, holding her son's hand. "They just said he needed to try harder. That he wasn't applying himself." Her son was 10. Already convinced he was broken. I thought about being married to a man who told me I needed to try harder at being acceptable. At being less embarrassing. At requiring less space. And I understood that the work I was doing now was teaching people to recognize their own worth before someone else's cruelty defined them. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I expected. Patricia had documented everything: Greg's financial control, his affair, the jewelry theft, his fabricated credentials. He had no grounds for contestation beyond desperation. He tried anyway. Filed a claim for partial ownership of Dorothy's estate, arguing that as her son he deserved inheritance regardless of what the will said. The judge reviewed Dorothy's capacity evaluations. 3 physicians confirming she was mentally sound when she changed her will. Read her explicit instructions. Listened to Greg's attorney make arguments even he didn't seem to believe. Dismissed the appeal in under 10 minutes. Greg's attorney, a tired man in his 50s who'd clearly seen this situation too many times, negotiated surrender rather than extended litigation. The final decree awarded me everything I already possessed legally. The house. The investments. The antique collection. Greg received exactly what Dorothy had originally intended. $25,000 and his father's watch collection. Patricia suggested I could ask for alimony. I was entitled, she said, based on the years of marriage and his financial control. I declined. I wanted nothing from Greg except distance. The decree included permanent restraining order terms. No contact. 500 feet minimum distance. Enforceable by law. On a Tuesday in May, I sat in family court while the judge declared my marriage dissolved. I felt neither triumph nor regret. Just completion. Like finishing a book I should have stopped reading years ago but had carried to the end out of habit rather than interest. Outside the courthouse, Patricia congratulated me formally. Then she added something unexpected. Dorothy would be proud of who you've become, she said. Not because of the foundation or the divorce, but because you chose to live like she mattered. Like her gift meant something beyond money. I thought about Dorothy's final months. Parkinson's stealing her speech but leaving her eyes alert. Watching me read aloud every evening. Holding my hand during difficult moments. She saw me before I saw myself, I said. Patricia nodded. That's what love does. It witnesses potential before circumstances allow it expression. I learned about Greg's current circumstances through indirect channels. Jennifer mentioning gossip she'd heard. Patricia sharing legally relevant updates when his attorney contacted her about final paperwork. He worked as assistant manager at a sporting goods store 40 minutes away. Made $42,000 annually. Lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with furniture from IKEA and minimal belongings. Brittany had left town in February. Took a marketing position in Colorado. Blocked him on every platform. Greg's brother allowed supervised visits with his nephew but didn't invite Greg to family gatherings anymore. His LinkedIn profile no longer claimed an MBA. Listed employment as retail management. Showed no recent activity. I searched for satisfaction in his reduced circumstances and found instead something closer to pity mixed with relief. Pity that he'd destroyed himself through lies he'd apparently believed. Relief that his destruction didn't require my ongoing participation. I wondered sometimes if Greg understood yet what he'd actually lost. Not the inheritance or the career. But the 12 years he'd spent with someone who would have loved him if he'd allowed space for mutual respect. Who would have supported his actual achievements if he'd pursued any. Someone who became his victim only because he'd required an audience for his performance. I suspected he didn't understand. That he narrated himself as victim of conspiracy rather than architect of consequence. But that wasn't my responsibility to teach anymore. My work now involved helping children recognize their strengths before adults taught them to see only deficits. If Greg never learned that lesson about himself, it was a tragedy. But it was his tragedy, not mine. On a Wednesday evening in late June, I sat on my porch. I'd finally started calling it mine instead of Dorothy's. Watching neighborhood kids bike past while dusk settled soft and warm. The house felt inhabited now rather than occupied. I'd hung my own artwork. Rearranged furniture to suit my habits. Planted tomatoes in the garden Dorothy had maintained until Parkinson's made kneeling impossible. The foundation served 83 students now. Had a 12-month waiting list. Employed 6 staff with plans to hire 2 more in September. Sarah Cartwright volunteered Saturdays, using her architecture training to help teenagers visualize spatial concepts. Margaret had secured additional grant funding that would allow expansion into 2 more districts. My divorce was final. My restraining order permanent. My teaching career transformed into something larger but rooted in the same conviction that every struggling learner deserved someone who refused to give up. My phone rang. Jennifer calling about summer plans. Suggesting we visit the new art museum exhibit downtown. I agreed easily, making plans like someone who had time and space and permission to build friendships I'd neglected for 12 years. After the call, I opened Dorothy's journal. I'd found it in her nightstand weeks ago. A leather-bound book containing entries spanning 40 years. Recipes and prayers and observations about ordinary life that felt sacred in their simplicity. The final entry was dated 6 days before Dorothy's death. "Rachel will be fine," she'd written in shaky handwriting that showed how much the effort cost her. "She has everything she needs now. Resources, allies, and most importantly, she has herself." Greg took many things from her, but he could never take her essential goodness. That survives intact, waiting for the space to grow. I'm leaving her that space. The rest is hers to build. I closed the journal carefully, feeling Dorothy's presence like benediction rather than haunting. And I thought about inheritance's true meaning. Not just money or property, but permission to become fully yourself after years of contraction. I had that permission now. I had space, resources, work that mattered. And I had the quiet evening peace of a woman who'd survived erasure and chosen to reconstruct herself with patience, with dignity, with refusal to become the bitterness that had been done to her. That, I thought, watching fireflies begin their summer dance across the darkening lawn, was vengeance's final form. Not destruction of those who harmed you, but construction of a life so rooted in meaning they became irrelevant to your happiness. Dorothy had known that. And now finally so did I. The fireflies rose higher, their lights blinking against the gathering darkness, each one carrying its own small illumination into the night. I sat on my porch and watched them, and I was content. If this story of quiet dignity and powerful justice had you hooked until the end, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when William revealed Rachel created all those programs Greg claimed as his own. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more inspiring stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.